Hello and welcome to this week's Lunch and Learn for Parashat Vayechi, which concludes the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis. Now, if I was to pick a parasha which I wanted to use to demonstrate some of the best techniques for trying to learn what the Chumash is teaching us, then Parashat Vayechi would be well high up there on the list. Because not only does it have fascinating storylines in it, but there is a wealth of information in three particular areas. The first is pshat, understanding the straightforward meaning of the text. The second is drush or midrash, the messages, the religious messages that we understand from the text. And the third is halacha, is some of the laws by which we live. And there are rich examples of all of these in Parashat Vayechi, and we will very shortly look at just one example of that and how the three of them link together. So first of all, just a summary of the material we find in this parasha. Yaakov, Jacob, our patriarch, is in Egypt close to the end of his days. He calls his son Joseph for some final words of blessing and some final words of command, and also blesses Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And there are some very famous blessings in there, which we say regularly in our prayers, such as Hamalach HaGoel Oti, etc. You might be familiar with the song. And also the injunction to bless like Ephraim and Manasseh, which is one of the reasons behind the blessing given to boys by parents or other adults in their families on a Friday night. Then there are Jacob's final words of blessing and testament to his other sons. Some are blessing, some of the words are blessing, some of the words are more testament and teachings, particularly about things in the past, and also prophecy for the future as well. And then we read about the passing of Jacob and his eventual burial in the cave of Machpelah in Hebron, and how Joseph asked Pharaoh's permission to go and carry out his father's commands to make sure the burial takes place in Hebron. Pharaoh agrees, but Joseph comes back to Egypt as if this is somehow a condition of him going to bury his father, that he has to come back to Egypt, and his family come back to Egypt with him, even though one might have considered they would stay in the land of Israel. And then towards the end of the parasha, Joseph also passes away, and like his father, he requests that his eventual burial should be in the land of Israel. Even though he has to be buried initially in Egypt, he says to his brothers to pass on the message that God will eventually bring the family, the nation as it will become of Bnei Israel, out of Egypt back to the land of Israel. And when that happens, says Joseph, please take my bones with you, and they should be reburied in the land of Israel. And with that, we end the book of Bereshit before next week continuing with the book of Shemot. So that's a very brief overview of what's in our parasha. Now, let's get to one particular topic, which I hope will illuminate ways of studying the Torah, and also how these three disciplines of pshat, the straightforward meaning of the text, the drush, the religious meaning of the text, and the halacha, the practical way we live, come together. And it's right at the beginning of the parasha. The parasha begins as follows. If you want to follow in a Chumash, this is in Bereshit, in Genesis, chapter 47, verse 28. Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim 17 shana. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. Vayehi yemei Yaakov shenei chayav, sheva shanim v'arba'im um'ad shana. And the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147. Vayikrevu yemei Yisrael lamut. And the time of Jacob's passing, Jacob known here by his additional name Israel, the time of his passing was coming close. Vayikra livno Yosef, and he called to his son Joseph particularly above any of his other sons. Vayomer lo imna matzati chen be'einecha. And Jacob said to Joseph, if I have found favor in your eyes, simna yadecha tachat tirechi, place your hand under my thigh, which was a way of making an oath. Va'asita imadi chesed ve'emet, and perform towards me both truth and kindness. Actually, the other way around, kindness and truth. Al na tikbareni b'Mitzrayim. Do not bury me in Egypt. And then Joseph, having heard his father, hears Jacob say the following, next part of the request. V'chachavti im avotai, and I will rest with my fathers. And satani mi Mitzrayim, and I will be brought up from Egypt, and I will be buried in their burial place. Vayomar, and Joseph replied, Anochi e'eseh chidvarecha. I will do according to your word. So Jacob then, to really make sure that the deal is sealed, Vayomer Hishavali says, swear to me, make an oath, Vayishavalo, and Joseph swears the oath, Vayishtachu Yisrael al Rosh Hamita. And Israel, Jacob, bowed down on the top of the bed where he was lying on. Now, the phrase I want to really focus over here on is, Al natik bereni b'Mitzrayim, please do not bury me in Egypt. On the face of it, an innocuous phrase, which doesn't seem to have that much to talk about. But when we dig beneath the surface, we'll see just how significant it is, not just in the story of Joseph and Jacob and what Jacob wanted to achieve, but in our understanding of how to study the Torah, how to study the Bible. So, first of all, the pshat, the straightforward meaning of the text, which was something which was pioneered particularly as a form of study by Rav Saadia Gaon, one of the great Babylonian Gaonim, geniuses and leaders in the 9th and 10th centuries, and then later on by the Rishonim, some of the great medieval scholars of Jewish history, famous names like Rashi, Ramban, Rav Avraham ibn Ezra, etc. And this idea of pshat is very ancient. It goes all the way back, at the very least, and further, to the earliest Targumim, the earliest translations of the Torah, such as Targum Onkelos, Targum Yonatan ben Uziel, and even the Septuagint. The first two in Aramaic, the third one into Greek, very, very ancient translations of the Torah. And they translate, particularly the Targum Onkelos, this phrase in that way, that Jacob says, do not bury me in Egypt. That was not the place where he wanted his burial to take place. And then when he says he will lie with his forefathers, with his ancestors, the commentary of Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra, the medieval great we just mentioned before, says, Kinui lamita. The pshat is, this is a phrase of dying. In other words, rather than I just want to lie with my ancestors, that's where Jacob wanted to die. He wanted to die in the land of Israel, not in the land of Egypt. So therefore, what the pshat is telling us, according to Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra, is really fascinating, because there are two verbs used, ukvartani, v'shachavti, burial and lying with ancestors, which in English effectively mean the same thing. But according to the Ibn Ezra, what Jacob is teaching us here, is telling Joseph, is that actually he didn't just want to be buried in the land of Israel, he wanted to pass away in the land of Israel. And this is reflected in a comment in the Talmud many centuries later, in the name of Ulla, a sage who would travel often, an Amoraic sage who would travel often between the land of Israel and Babylon, and was very distressed when he felt he was going to pass away. He was nearing his end and he was in Babylon. Because he said it wasn't just a question of being buried in the land of Israel, somehow he wanted to pass away there as well. That's where he wanted his final moments, at the very least, to be. And we'll see presently how this has a very interesting halachic ramification as well. So already our antennae are raised as to what the difference should be between burial and lying with an ancestor. And that's the approach which the Ibn Ezra takes. Rabbi Ovadia Sforno, in the 16th century, a great Italian scholar, says that when Jacob says to Joseph, do not bury me in Egypt, he says, afilu ba'aron, even in a box or even in a coffin, which of course is different to what happened to Joseph at the end of the Parasha. When Joseph is buried, he was buried in a coffin. That's what happened. Because, says that Rabbi Ovadia Sforno, that if Jacob is buried in a coffin, he says, that's going to be it. Then the Egyptians won't let you, Joseph. They won't let you take my remains back to the Marat HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. They'll say, Jacob's buried here. And that's where we want it to be. So it'd be disrespectful even to take him away. Don't do it. So therefore, says the Sforno, the idea of burial must be burial literally. Don't let burial happen in any way, even if it's not in the ground per se. It shouldn't be even in a coffin, according to this explanation of the Sforno, lest anybody try and frustrate Jacob's wishes to go to the land of Israel. Now Rashi, who's possibly our most famous commentator, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who sometimes deals with the pshat, the straightforward meaning of the text, but often also brings a midrash, a rabbinic teaching, gives us a very different perspective on what this phrase means of Anati Barini b'Mitzrayim, do not bury me in Egypt. And it's worthwhile, I think, just understanding a little bit about what Rashi means when he brings a midrash. One of the great scholars of British Jewry in recent times, very sadly passed away a couple of weeks ago, was the late Rabbi Dr. Irving Jacobs, who was an amazing pedagogue, teacher and mentor to many rabbis and others. He taught in Jews College where he was the principal. He was the rabbi of the Neve Shalom community in Wembley most recently, and a beloved and very popular teacher around the Jewish community. Rabbi Jacobs in particular was a mesmerizing teacher of Midrash, and he defined Midrash as when the rabbis, so to speak, rolled up their sleeves, the rabbis of the Talmudic period approximately, rolled up their sleeves and told us what Judaism should mean to us, what the religious messages that we hear from the Torah. It's one thing to translate the Torah, that's important, but there's another thing to work out what it means to me. What are the messages for me in the way that I live my life? And of course, this is what rabbis and teachers do whenever they are expounding the Torah. And we learn about the concerns which they had. We learn about the milieu which they lived in, and we learn about what are the timeless messages of Judaism. And Rabbi Jacobs once suggested to, at a rabbinic event which he was teaching us at, he once suggested that if we were to take some sermons and bury them in the ground in a time capsule, perhaps couldn't bury some of them deep enough, he joked with us. But if we were to bury them in a time capsule, and in 1,000 years' time, people would dig up the time capsule and they would study those sermons to think about what were on the minds of Jews at this stage in our history, in the year 2020 as we are now. What were the concerns we had? What were the important values which we had to teach? And they would also see what are the timeless values of Judaism in every generation, not just the things which are specific to each generation, which have been taught by rabbis and scholars, parents and educators and teachers ever since they were first taught. And so this is what Midrash does. It gives us religious messages for us to think about from the text in the way that we live our lives. So Rashi, quoting one of our most famous Midrashim, Bereshit Rabbah, says as follows: what does Al Natik Bareini b'Mitzrayim mean? Rashi is asking that question. What's the significance of those words, and how are they different from Jacob's request to lie with his forefathers? So Rashi says as follows. He says in the second part of his explanation that the one who passes away in the diaspora is not considered to be alive, but rather somehow is going to have the pains of being in the diaspora and can't get back to Eretz Yisrael. And finally, says that Midrash, Jacob was also concerned that the Egyptians wouldn't make a deity out of him. The Midrash teaches that Egypt was blessed through Jacob's presence there. And of course, that blessing would end once Jacob had passed away. So he was very concerned for two reasons not to be buried in Egypt. Number one, that the Egyptians wouldn't make an idol out of him, or at least out of his resting place. And number two, that he wouldn't be disconnected from the land of Israel, that somehow, even in death, a person should have a connection to the land of Israel, and the soul somehow would feel a sense of tsar, a sense of pain in being disconnected from the land of Israel. Now, what does this midrash mean? Well, what is it trying to teach us? What were the rabbis saying to us? Perhaps they were saying to us some very important lessons about our connection to understanding what burial means, and also our connection to the land of Israel. One of the most profound Jewish scholars of recent times was the late Rabbi Yosef Shalom Eliashiv, a great scholar, particularly halachist in Jerusalem, and Talmud scholar, but who also wrote, as with all of his writings, in a very incisive way on the Parasha, on the weekly Torah reading. And Rabbi Eliashiv links what Jacob requests here to his other request to Joseph to perform both kindness and truth to him, that the kindness is to take him up to the land of Israel and bury him there, and the truth is to make sure that the truth of monotheism and the truth of God's rule in the world and avoidance of idolatry takes place as well. And Rabbi Eliashiv notes, learning a lesson from this midrash, just as the original rabbis who taught this midrash taught us lessons. Even Rabbi Eliashiv, writing in the 20th century, would teach us lessons based on this as well. That Jacob was very concerned to make sure that he had a connection to the land of Israel. And that even in Egypt, even with the promises given by God to our ancestors that we would inherit the land of Israel, Jacob wanted something tangible there as well. He wanted to make sure that he never had the pain of disconnection from the land of Israel. And one can imagine a rabbi saying to his congregants, be they in Babylon, be they in the land of Israel, be they elsewhere, that we should always feel that connection. It's not possible for everybody to be buried in the land of Israel. The Midrash does not have in the main halachic material, legal material in there, which binds us into the way that we act in the service of God. It's there to teach us ideas, but everybody should feel that connection. And of course, there were even times in the first 5 centuries of the last millennium when the Jews in the land of Israel, even though their learning flourished, faced grave difficulties in existing in the land of Israel, be it at the destruction of the temple, approximately in the year 70 CE, be it approximately 65 or so years later, with the Hadrianic persecutions, where many, many Jews lost their lives, be it the rise of Christianity, especially in the Roman Empire, which affected the land of Israel. Those were not always easy times for Jews. On the contrary, they were sometimes very, very tough. And there were attempts to disconnect us from our faith and to disconnect us even from the land of Israel. But a person should never lose that sense of connection, say the rabbis of the Midrash, and there's almost a sense of pain in our soul if we were to do so. So whereas the Pshat has told us that Jacob was very concerned, if at all possible, to die in the land of Israel, sadly that wish was not fulfilled, but at the very least to be buried in the land of Israel, that's the straightforward meaning of what he is asking. The Midrash is telling us that Jacob also wanted to teach lessons from his burial, that people would not relate to him in an idolatrous way, and that also he wouldn't have the pain of having to somehow spiritually go back to the land of Israel after death. He wanted that connection with the land of Israel. And I suppose somewhat remarkably, our oldest known Jewish burial site in the land of Israel is the cave of Machpelah, where our tradition tells us that Adam and Eve are buried alongside Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebecca, and Jacob and Leah. And the burial site of Rachel is separate from there. It is also referenced in our Parasha this week, but is understood, or at least marked by a site south of Jerusalem. Whether that's the exact site or not, we're not entirely sure. But these are some of our oldest known burial areas in the land of Israel, having achieved, I suppose, what Jacob wanted us to achieve, because we've known about them for many, many centuries, a millennia and more. And we have always been able to link back to them and always think about them. So these phrases, Ukvartani b'Mitzrayim, v'shachavtiim avotai, are very important in teaching us about these 2 ways of studying the Torah. And Rashi amplifies on the message we saw from the Ibn Ezra that lying with one's fathers, v'shachavtiim avotai, has a similar meaning of being passing away in the land of Israel as well. Now, why does this have a relevance in halakha at the same time? Some of you may recall in the 1970s, a really fascinating question in Jewish law that was asked, that was particularly relevant to England. In Ramsgate is the mausoleum and the synagogue of the late Sir Moses Montefiore, and also the burial place of his wife was Our Lady Montefiore. And this is a very, very famous part of Anglo-Jewish history. And when Sir Moses Montefiore passed away, he was not only buried in Ramsgate, but left instructions that there should be a fund which continued to support scholars studying Torah, studying to become rabbis and other teachers in the community. And of course, that fund through the Montefiore College continues to train rabbis and other leaders to this day. But in the 1970s, the question was asked as to whether it was appropriate to exhume Rabbi Sir Moses Montefiore's remains and take them to be buried in the land of Israel, as has happened to a number of other famous Jewish figures over time. Theodor Herzl, for instance, was reinterred on Har Herzl in the land of Israel. And there'd been a number of rabbinic figures as well, of whom the question had been asked as to whether they should be reburied in the land of Israel, given the merit, so to speak, of being buried in the land of Israel that we learn about from Jacob. So the question was asked about Sir Moses Montefiore. What was the most appropriate thing to do? Now, the question is covered in some detail by Dayan Pinchas Toledano, of course, for many years served as the head of the Sephardi Beth Din here in London. Here is a copy of Dayan Toledano's halachic writings. They're called She'elot Utshuvot, that's Shut. You can see on the, over here, it says Shut, Brit Shalom, Covenant of Peace. And Dayan Toledano also published in an Israeli journal of halakha called Tzuchumim. This is volume 8, published in 1987, and gave a very long description, not just of his own position on this, but of some of the leading decisors of Jewish law in his day. Very famous figures such as Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, Zichronam Livracha, may their memories be for a blessing, and how they addressed this particular question. And of course, it's a question which is not just asked of Rabbi Moses Montefiore, but it's been asked of other famous figures, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, for instance. And is also asked about the Jews who happen to be buried outside of Israel, but when the opportunity arises, either their stated preference before death was to be buried in the land of Israel, or their family wishes to consider moving their remains to the land of Israel. And Dayan Toledano lays out the background to this particular question. He says that it was the matter of moving the remains of Sir Moses Montefiore was raised from time to time, and it was also affected by the fact that there is a beautiful shul in Ramsgate. Some of you may have visited it, which Sir Moses Montefiore constructed, and that he commanded that there should be, as much as possible, a yeshiva near his burial place. That's the learning yeshiva represented today by the Montefiore College. And of course, he provided in his will, very generously, as in his life, support for them to study. Now, Dayan Toledano says, for many years at the time of writing, the shul in Ramsgate had been closed. It didn't have a regular meeting on Shabbat or on Yom Tov, and certainly not on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And now everybody that was studying in this particular program connected to Sir Moses Montefiore's legacy was in London instead. There was no longer there was neither a Sephardi community or an Ashkenazi community in Ramsgate. So therefore, is it time to say that now is the opportunity to transfer the remains of Sir Moses Montefiore to Israel, where perhaps he will have a greater eternal rest spiritually, and I suppose there wouldn't be any doubt as to whether his remains would be looked after in the most dignified way, because it would be in the lands of Israel rather than in a place where there is no Jewish community that is active in any way. So Dayan Toledano goes through at some length the various issues which arise in this question in Jewish law. Is one allowed to go against the expressed wishes of the deceased, if it's for the benefit of the deceased, so to speak? Is one allowed to impute a desire on behalf of the deceased, even if it wasn't expressly stated? And are bodies allowed to be exhumed and moved to another place for reburial if there isn't a very pressing need to be able to do so? An example of a pressing need was, sadly, because it was a very deeply upsetting thing to have to be involved with, but the moving of Jewish cemetery from Gush Katif when Jews left that area around 14 or 15 years ago. And the cemetery had to be moved to inside the state of Israel to protect it from possible damage. So of the three rabbis to whom the question was posted, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, great Ashkenazi rabbinic authority in New York, who passed away in 1986, noted that in his view, it was forbidden to move the mausoleum. There was no pressing need to do so at this point. One should not disturb the remains of someone who has been buried, and in his view, it's without express particularly request from Sir Moses Montefiore, the remains should be left where they are. On the other hand, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who passed away in 2015, and Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, who passed away not so long afterwards, both former chief rabbis of Israel, felt that there were grounds to permit the reinterment of Sir Moses Montefiore in the land of Israel, and to set up a scholarly fund and scholarly enterprise in the land of Israel, very, very close to where he would be reburied, therefore fulfilling Sir Moses Montefiore's express wishes that this kollel or learning program did not have to be in London or in Ramsgate specifically, according to this view, and their understanding of Sir Moses Montefiore's final instructions in his will. It had to be close to his resting place, and therefore there would be learning taking place there, which would be in the merits of Sir Moses and Lady Judith Montefiore, and as he had stipulated. Despite both Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Eliyahu holding this view, nonetheless, the view of Rabbi Feinstein was the one which is accepted here, and as we know, the remains of Sir Moses Montefiore remain in Ramsgate, and I imagine will do so for the foreseeable future. But some of the questions which we need to ask when confronted with a matter of halacha like this go directly back to our Parasha, to Vayechi, to the request of Yaakov Avinu, to what burial meant, to what passing away would mean in terms of the timing and the place that it would be in, and to a specific request to be able to take the remains of a deceased person from one place to another, especially to the land of Israel, which is what Yaakov mentioned. So to summarize, we've seen two very short phrases, Fartani b'Mitzrayim in particular, and V'shachabti avotai, and bury me in Egypt. Please do not bury me in Egypt. Al na'tik b'reini b'Mitzrayim. Do not bury me in Egypt, and let me rest with my forefathers in Hebron, in the cave of Machpelah. We've seen how the pshat, the straightforward meaning of the text, distinguishes between time and place of death, and the actual burial as well, and what burial means, whether this is in a coffin or it's in the ground. And in fact, this also has halachic ramifications as to what we would call today stimat hagolel, the closing of a tomb. What we would normally say is the filling in of the tomb, but at least according to the view of Rashi, this is achieved by the closing of a coffin. And this has ramifications, particularly at the moment, sadly, with the COVID conditions, for how the nearest and dearest, the mourners for someone who sadly has passed away, might be able to participate safely in a burial by having the opportunity to close the coffin, even if they can't necessarily go to the graveside. So we've seen that the pshat is important to understand what the meaning of these words is. We've seen a midrashic approach to what the significance of these words is and the concepts they are teaching. The importance of making sure in Jacob's case that he didn't want anyone to relate to him in an idolatrous way. He wanted instead that in his death, not just in his life, he would teach monotheism and connection to God, and to always maintain that connection to the land of Israel. One can imagine the drashot, the sermons given by rabbis in the land of Israel and other places, despite the hardships people were facing, linking us back to Jacob, sermons which are equally applicable today, and the lessons which are equally applicable today, and the lessons for how we should live our lives, to live as invigorated people with our Judaism, and bringing meaning to ourselves and to others wherever we go from our Judaism. These are the lessons of the Midrash, particularly in the way I've tried to reflect the teachings of the late Rabbi Dr. Irving Jacob, Zichrono Livracha. And then finally, we've seen what the halachic position would be on a related question. That's the reinterment of Sir Moses Montefiore, and how, in the view of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, there was no necessity to move the remains to the land of Israel from Ramsgate. Burial is permitted, certainly, in the diaspora. There's no doubt about that. Sadly, that happens on a very regular basis. Without express permission, request rather, from Sir Moses Montefiore, there was no pressing need to move the remains, and the importance of letting the remains lie in peace was much more significant than moving them to the land of Israel per se. On the other hand, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef and Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu felt that there were grounds to permit the moving of the remains, particularly if a learning center was set up per Sir Moses' instructions near to his grave. But the view of Rabbi Feinstein was the one that was considered to be persuasive in this matter. And as I mentioned before, all of these things link back to what we learn in Parasha Vayechi. So as we close off the book of Parasha this week, I hope that you are all safe and well, most importantly, I hope you can enjoy studying this wonderful parasha and have some more tools to do so now for different ways that we understand our text, different ways our rabbis have taught us to learn the Torah, and our tradition helps us learn from the Torah, and that we should move into the book of Shemot, the amazing stories of the flourishing of our nation despite the initial great difficulties, and then the exodus from Egypt, the revelation at Mount Sinai, and the building of the Mishkan as we move into the desert, and each week be able to look at Pshat, look at Midrash, and learn some halacha to keep us living and learning as Jews every single day. I wish you well. Shabbat Shalom.